April 15th, 1945, 12:30 hours. Limestone Cave Complex, southern Okinawa. Sachiko Nakamura pressed her 8-year-old daughter Yuki closer to her chest as the sound of American voices grew louder outside their hiding place. For 3 weeks, they had survived on wild grass and rainwater collected in rusty cans. Yuki's ribs showed through her torn dress, and her eyes had the hollow look of children who had forgotten what food meant. The propaganda broadcasts had been clear. American demons would torture civilians, rape women, and eat children alive. Better to die with honor than face such monsters. But when exhaustion and starvation had made suicide impossible, hiding became their only choice. Heavy boots approached the cave mouth. Sachiko covered Yuki's eyes, expecting gunfire or worse. Instead, a calm American voice called into the darkness in broken Japanese, "Daijobu desu, tabemono arimasu." It's okay, we have food. For Japanese civilians who had been taught to fear American soldiers as inhuman monsters, the greatest shock of defeat came not from bombs or bullets, but from the moment enemy hands offered them chocolate bars, canned meat, and chewing gum, transforming their understanding of both war and humanity with the simple gift of abundance. The Starvation Island. Okinawa in early 1945 had become a laboratory of human suffering where 300,000 civilians found themselves trapped between armies fighting for control of their homeland. The Japanese military had commandeered all available food supplies for combat troops, leaving civilians to subsist on whatever they could forage from bomb-cratered fields and destroyed villages. The traditional Okinawan diet of sweet potatoes, vegetables, and occasional fish had disappeared as the battle raged. Military orders prohibited civilians from surrendering to American forces, threatening execution for anyone who attempted to seek protection from the advancing enemy. Families were driven into cave systems and underground hideouts, where they slowly starved while the battle raged overhead. By April 1945, civilian deaths from starvation and disease exceeded combat casualties among the defending Japanese forces. Children developed kwashiorkor, their stomachs distended from malnutrition while their limbs wasted to skeletal proportions. Adults lost the strength to care for their families, and elderly people died quietly in dark corners of caves where their bodies couldn't be properly buried. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Constant hunger destroyed social bonds as people competed for scraps of food. Parents watched their children slowly dying while being powerless to help. The traditional Okinawan culture of community support collapsed under the weight of systematic starvation that the Japanese military had imposed through its total war policies. The propaganda machine. Japanese civilians on Okinawa had been subjected to an intensive propaganda campaign designed to prevent surrender and ensure continued resistance even after military defeat became inevitable. Radio broadcasts, military announcements, and word-of-mouth campaigns painted Americans as subhuman beasts who would commit atrocities against any civilians they captured. The propaganda emphasized racial superiority and portrayed Americans as racially mixed mongrels, incapable of honor or mercy. Children learned songs about brave Japanese soldiers fighting demon-faced enemies who ate human flesh and tortured prisoners for sport. School lessons taught that death was preferable to capture by forces that represented everything evil in the world. Village leaders repeated military orders that anyone showing white flags or attempting to surrender would be executed as traitors to the emperor. Families were instructed to kill themselves rather than face capture, with grenades and other weapons distributed specifically for mass suicide when American forces approached their positions. The systematic indoctrination created terror that exceeded rational fear of military occupation. Civilians literally believed that Americans were supernatural monsters rather than human soldiers, making any positive contact seem impossible until direct experience proved otherwise. The abundance doctrine. American military logistics in the Pacific operated according to supply doctrines that treated soldier welfare as strategic necessity rather than luxury. The rations carried by individual soldiers exceeded the caloric intake of most civilians in wartime Japan, while field kitchens and supply dumps contained food stores that could feed entire communities. Each American soldier carried daily rations, providing approximately 3,700 calories through combinations of canned meat, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, and various preserved foods. K rations and C rations were designed to maintain morale and fighting effectiveness through abundant nutrition that kept troops healthy and psychologically satisfied even under combat conditions. Beyond individual rations, American forces maintained supply lines that delivered fresh food, additional canned goods, and luxury items like ice cream and soft drinks to forward positions. The logistical capability that supported these operations treated food abundance as fundamental requirement rather than special privilege, creating surplus that could be shared with civilian populations. The contrast with Japanese military rations was stark. Japanese soldiers often subsisted on rice mixed with barley, occasional vegetables, and preserved fish when available. By 1945, even military rations had been reduced to near starvation levels as Japanese supply lines collapsed under Allied interdiction and resource shortages. First contact. The chocolate revelation. The initial encounters between starving Okinawan civilians and American soldiers occurred throughout April and May 1945 as combat operations shifted from cave clearing to occupation duties. These meetings consistently followed patterns that shocked both sides. Americans discovered the extent of civilian suffering, while Japanese discovered that their supposed enemies showed unexpected humanity. Private Tommy Kowalski from Chicago had fought through 2 years of Pacific campaigns before reaching Okinawa. His experience with Japanese military fanaticism had prepared him for continued resistance, but the discovery of starving families hiding in caves required completely different responses than combat training had provided. "We found this cave with maybe 20 people inside," Kowalski wrote to his wife. "Old folks, women, little kids, all of them skin and bones. They were so scared they couldn't even cry. I opened my rations and started handing out chocolate bars. The kids had never seen chocolate before. They didn't know what to do with it. The chocolate bars that American soldiers carried represented more than simple candy to civilians who had forgotten what sugar tasted like. The Hershey bars contained cocoa, milk, and sweetness that created sensory experiences these children had never known. For adults, the gesture of receiving food from enemies who were supposed to kill them challenged every assumption about the nature of warfare and human character. Young Yuki Nakamura took her first bite of chocolate with trembling hands, expecting poison or tricks. When the sweetness hit her tongue, her eyes widened with disbelief. She had never tasted anything like it. Concentrated sweetness that seemed too good to be real, coming from hands that were supposed to bring only death and suffering. The spam distribution. Canned meat became another revelation that demonstrated American abundance to civilians who had survived on grass and tree bark for weeks. The canned ham, beef stew, and especially spam represented protein sources that most Okinawans hadn't seen since the beginning of the war. Sergeant Bob Martinez organized food distribution in the village of Shuri after combat operations moved north. His squad had discovered over 200 civilians hiding in tunnels beneath the destroyed town, including families who had been living underground for 6 weeks without adequate food or sanitation. The distribution process required careful management to prevent riots among desperate people. Martinez established orderly lines where civilians received canned meat, crackers, and other rations according to family size and medical need. The systematic organization impressed villagers who had expected chaos and cruelty from occupying forces. Elder Taro Yamashiro had served as village headman before the battle and understood logistics from organizing community resources during peacetime. His observation of American food distribution revealed organizational capabilities that exceeded anything he had witnessed from Japanese military administration. "They had more food in one supply truck than our village had seen in a year," Yamashiro testified after the war. "But what amazed me was how they organized the distribution. Everyone got equal shares, children received extra rations, and sick people got special foods for their conditions. They treated us better than our own government had." The coffee culture. American instant coffee provided Okinawan civilians with their first taste of a beverage that most had only heard about through stories of Western customs. The bitter, stimulating drink created cultural bridges that transcended language barriers and demonstrated American habits that seemed both exotic and generous. The coffee distribution often occurred during evening gatherings when American soldiers shared their rations around cooking fires established in destroyed villages. Japanese civilians observed American customs of casual conversation over hot drinks, social behaviors that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy and formality that had characterized their interactions with Japanese military personnel. Mrs. Hanako Suzuki, a schoolteacher from Naha, described her first coffee experience. "The American soldier poured hot water over brown powder and handed me the cup. The taste was bitter, strange, but warming. He gestured for me to sit beside the fire and drink slowly. For the first time in months, I felt like a human being, rather than a refugee." The social ritual of sharing coffee created opportunities for limited communication despite language barriers. American soldiers attempted basic Japanese phrases, while civilians learned English words for thank you and please. These linguistic exchanges helped establish personal connections that made continued cooperation possible. The chewing gum mystery. Chewing gum presented Okinawan children with a completely foreign concept that required explanation and demonstration. The idea of food that wasn't meant to be swallowed challenged their understanding of eating while providing harmless entertainment that distracted from their traumatic experiences. The first encounters with chewing gum often involved confusion and comedy that created moments of genuine laughter in circumstances where joy had seemed impossible. Children would chew briefly, then attempt to swallow the gum, leading to gentle corrections from American soldiers who demonstrated the proper technique. 10-year-old Jiro Miyagi received his first piece of chewing gum from Corporal Danny Walsh, who showed him how to work his jaw without swallowing. The sustained flavor and the mechanical action of chewing provided sensory stimulation that helped calm the boy's anxiety while demonstrating American generosity in sharing items that had no survival value but provided simple pleasure. "The soldier showed me how to blow bubbles," Miyagi recalled decades later. "I thought it was magic, making spheres of pink rubber appear from my mouth. The other children gathered around to watch, and soon we were all trying to blow bubbles. For those few minutes, we forgot about the war and just played like normal children." The medical rations. American medical supplies included specialized foods designed for treating malnutrition and supporting recovery from illness. These medical rations provided nutrients specifically needed by civilians who had suffered from prolonged starvation and vitamin deficiencies. Army Medic Corporal James Sullivan carried medical rations containing concentrated vitamins, protein supplements, and easily digestible foods designed for treating severe malnutrition. His training included procedures for feeding severely malnourished civilians without causing digestive complications that could prove fatal. "You couldn't just give them regular food," Sullivan explained in post-war interviews. "Their stomachs had shrunk, their digestive systems weren't working properly. We had special formulas, milk powder, vitamin tablets, foods that would build them up gradually without making them sick." The medical feeding programs required patience and careful monitoring as civilians gradually recovered their ability to digest normal foods. The process often took weeks, but the systematic approach demonstrated American commitment to civilian welfare that exceeded basic humanitarian obligations. The supply abundance American supply operations on Okinawa demonstrated logistical capabilities that amazed Japanese observers familiar with chronic shortages that had characterized their wartime experience. Military supply dumps contained quantities of food that exceeded anything most civilians had seen even during peacetime abundance. The visible abundance in American supply areas challenged Japanese propaganda claims about enemy resource limitations and industrial weakness. Civilians could observe warehouses filled with canned goods, fresh produce flown in from distant bases, and luxury items that seemed to flow endlessly from American supply ships offshore. Warehouse Supervisor Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien managed food distribution for military government operations that fed over 50,000 civilians daily by June 1945. His facility contained foods that most Okinawans had never seen: canned fruit, processed cheese, white bread, and meat products that represented industrial food processing unknown in traditional Japanese cuisine. "We had so much food we didn't know what to do with it all," O'Brien recalled. Fresh apples flown in from the States, canned peaches, all kinds of stuff. The local people would stare at our warehouses like they were looking at treasure caves. I guess to them, that's exactly what they were. The children's transformation. The physical and psychological transformation of Okinawan children who received American rations provided visible evidence of the impact that adequate nutrition had on human development. Children who had been listless and withdrawn began showing energy and curiosity as their nutritional status improved. The change was particularly dramatic among infants and toddlers whose growth had been stunted by malnutrition. American baby formula, canned milk, and specialized infant foods allowed rapid recovery that amazed both parents and medical personnel monitoring their progress. Nurse Lieutenant Helen Chang documented the recovery of dozens of malnourished children. Within 2 weeks of adequate feeding, you could see the difference. Their hair started growing back, their skin improved, and most importantly, they started playing and laughing like normal children. Food was literally bringing them back to life. The psychological changes accompanied physical recovery as children who had lived in constant fear began trusting American personnel who consistently provided food, medical care, and protection. These relationships often became the foundation for broader community acceptance of American occupation policies. The cultural exchange. Food sharing created opportunities for cultural exchange that helped both Americans and Japanese civilians understand each other as individuals rather than enemy stereotypes. These interactions often began with simple gestures around shared meals and expanded into broader communications about families, homes, and hopes for the future. Corporal Eddie Nakayama, a Japanese-American soldier from Hawaii, served as interpreter for civilian relations in central Okinawa. His ability to speak both languages allowed deeper communications that revealed the human costs of war on both sides. "When they found out I was Japanese-American, they couldn't believe it," Nakayama recalled. "They thought all Japanese in America had been killed or imprisoned. Learning that my family was safe in Hawaii, that I had grown up American while keeping Japanese culture, it challenged everything they thought they knew about America." The cultural exchanges often involved sharing information about peacetime life, family traditions, and personal hopes that transcended political boundaries. American soldiers learned about Okinawan customs, while Japanese civilians discovered American family values and social practices that contradicted propaganda stereotypes. The administrative challenge. Managing food distribution for hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians required administrative capabilities that demonstrated American organizational competence to Japanese observers who had experienced the chaos of their own government's collapse during the final months of war. Military government officers established registration systems that tracked civilian populations, assessed nutritional needs, and distributed resources according to medical priorities rather than social status or political considerations. The systematic approach impressed Japanese officials who had struggled with resource allocation during the war's final desperate phase. Captain William Hayes commanded civilian affairs for the southern sector of Okinawa, overseeing food distribution that reached over 150,000 displaced persons by August 1945. His operation required coordination between military supply units, medical personnel, and local leaders who helped implement distribution policies. "We were feeding more people than lived in most American cities," Hayes reported to his superiors. "The logistics were incredible, tracking families, medical conditions, special dietary needs, but it worked because we had the resources and the organizational systems to make it work." The Reconstruction meals. As immediate starvation ended and basic nutrition was restored, American authorities began introducing foods that would support long-term reconstruction of Okinawan society. These programs included agricultural supplies, cooking equipment, and foods that could form the basis for renewed local food production. The transition from emergency feeding to sustainable nutrition required teaching new food preparation techniques, introducing unfamiliar ingredients, and helping communities rebuild their capacity for independent food production. American personnel worked with local leaders to identify foods that could be integrated into traditional Okinawan cuisine. Home economics specialist Lieutenant Dorothy Kim taught Okinawan women to prepare American-style foods using available ingredients while incorporating traditional cooking methods that made the foods acceptable to local tastes. These classes became social centers where women shared experiences and rebuilt community connections. "We weren't trying to make them American," Kim explained. "We were trying to give them tools to rebuild their lives." Some American foods worked well with their cooking styles: canned meat in traditional stews, flour for different kinds of bread. It was about survival and adaptation. The generational impact. Children who experienced American food sharing during the occupation carried those memories throughout their lives, often becoming advocates for peaceful relations between Japan and America. The sensory memories of chocolate, chewing gum, and abundant meals created positive associations that influenced their understanding of international relations. Many of these children went on to careers that involved continued contact with Americans, working as interpreters, teachers, or business representatives in the post-war relationship that developed between former enemies. Their childhood experiences of American generosity provided personal foundations for political and economic cooperation. The generational impact extended to families where grandparents shared stories of American kindness with grandchildren born long after the war ended. These oral histories helped maintain memories of a time when enemies chose mercy over vengeance and abundance over hoarding. The economic lessons. The abundance that American forces could afford to share with civilian populations provided object lessons in economic systems that challenged Japanese understanding of resource management and industrial capacity. The casual distribution of valuable foods demonstrated wealth that exceeded anything most Japanese had experienced. Japanese economists and government officials who observed American supply operations began understanding the industrial capacity that had enabled American victory. The ability to feed hundreds of thousands of enemy civilians while maintaining military operations revealed economic power that Japanese planners had never accurately assessed. These observations influenced post-war Japanese economic policies that emphasized industrial production, international trade, and consumer abundance rather than military spending and resource hoarding. The demonstration of American prosperity became a model for rebuilding Japanese society along democratic and capitalist lines. The diplomatic foundation. Food sharing between American soldiers and Japanese civilians created personal relationships that provided emotional foundations for the post-war alliance between former enemies. The memories of kindness shown during vulnerable moments created trust that supported larger political arrangements. Many Japanese who received American rations during the occupation became advocates for continued friendship with America throughout the Cold War period. Their personal experiences of American generosity provided credible testimony about American character that supported political leaders who promoted Western alliance. The diplomatic impact extended beyond individual relationships to broader cultural understanding that made peaceful coexistence possible between nations that had fought with deadly hatred just months earlier. Food became a bridge between cultures that had seemed irreconcilably opposed. The transformation complete. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, over 200,000 Okinawan civilians were receiving daily food rations from American sources. The transformation from starvation to adequate nutrition had been accompanied by psychological changes that altered fundamental attitudes toward America and democracy. The children who had learned to blow bubbles with American chewing gum grew up to become leaders in post-war Japan's economic miracle. The elderly who had received their first taste of coffee from enemy soldiers became advocates for peaceful international relations. The mothers who had watched their children's health restored by enemy generosity became bridges between cultures that built lasting friendship from the ashes of total war. The shock of receiving food from supposed demons had revealed that enemies could become protectors, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, and that democracy could choose mercy over vengeance even in the moment of total victory. For Japanese civilians, who had been amazed when American soldiers shared their rations, that amazement became the foundation for a transformed understanding of what was possible when nations chose cooperation over conflict, abundance over scarcity, and humanity over hatred. In the end, the taste of chocolate, the warmth of coffee, and the simple pleasure of chewing gum accomplished what military conquest alone could never achieve. The transformation of fear into trust, hatred into friendship, and enemies into allies who would stand together for decades of peace and prosperity, built on the memory of kindness shared in humanity's darkest hour.